when Donald Trump has expressed concern in the past that Putin is just stringing him along, this looks like stringing along of President Trump par excellence by Vladimir Putin. It's quite an interesting thing now, Daryl, that we see Zelensky saying, "Okay, put your money where your mouth is. Come to Turkey on Thursday in 4 days' time. I'll be there waiting for you."
Volodymyr Zelensky has offered to meet with Vladimir Putin personally in Turkey on Thursday. It's quite a bold offer, this, isn't it, from the Ukrainian president, and it comes after the US president, Donald Trump, demanded that Ukraine agree to Putin's offer of direct talks between the two countries. That happened a couple of hours ago. Ukraine had previously made clear that talks would only happen if Russia committed to a ceasefire beginning tonight. It's now 1 o'clock in the morning in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, and as of now, that ceasefire doesn't appear to have materialised. Earlier I spoke to Alexander Kara, former advisor to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry.
First of all, this approach has shown that effectively Donald Trump failed to impose his vision of bringing peace to Ukraine, because the formula was to have a ceasefire, a 30 days ceasefire, then the long-term ceasefire, and then peace talks. And now he's exerting pressure over Zelensky to immediately accept the Putin's offer to meet. And actually, Zelensky got this challenge, and he is ready to meet Putin. It's unlikely that Vladimir Putin will travel from Moscow to Istanbul for security reasons and for many other reasons as well. But I don't think that anything has changed, because I believe it's rather rhetorical maneuvering than the genuine belief in the Kremlin that it's time to stop this war.
Alexander Kara speaking to me earlier. Well, Leigh Turner is a former British ambassador to Ukraine and the author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. Leigh, good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for being with us. Can we just deal with something straight off the bat here? A meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin is unlikely to happen in Turkey on Thursday, isn't it?
I think it probably is. The two of them haven't met, as far as I can see, since 2019, which is before Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And both sides here are trying to show that it's not them who are preventing an end to this war. But the key point, as your previous speaker was saying, is that by calling for talks without a ceasefire, Russia is actually rejecting the call that Europe and the US have made for a 30-day ceasefire. They want to just start talking. And they've also said, very interestingly, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said today, and I quote, she said, "Negotiations about the initial reasons for the war must happen first, and then a conversation about a ceasefire." In other words, the whole mass of maximalist Russian conditions that we've heard repeated again and again over the last 3 years must all come before any ceasefire. So they're really trying to push the Russians, trying to push the ceasefire into the long grass.
Okay. Just on that as well, a ceasefire being a condition of these talks on Thursday, or Zelensky engaging in these talks. A ceasefire not forthcoming. European leaders and Donald Trump, with Donald Trump's permission, put Monday as a deadline. We're expecting sanctions then if no ceasefire materialises today. As I say, it's the early hours of the morning there. But Donald Trump also tonight has effectively sort of tried to sort of encourage Zelensky. In fact, he has said, Ukraine should agree immediately to talks on Thursday, presumably without a ceasefire. So is what's happened tonight, Leigh, Donald Trump undermining what Europe have demanded, and actually Donald Trump demanded over the weekend?
It doesn't seem consistent, does it? It's very hard to keep track of President Trump's position on this. As you were saying, we saw over the weekend a bit of a ramping up of pressure on Moscow, on President Putin, not only from the Europeans who went to Kiev to show their support for President Zelensky, but also from Trump. The Europeans and the Americans seemed to be coordinating their line. And as you say, what we were expecting was to see that if the Russians didn't agree to a ceasefire, then we'd get some serious sanctions starting Monday. Now, in my view, those sanctions should still go ahead. And when Donald Trump has expressed concern in the past that Putin is just stringing him along, this looks like stringing along of President Trump par excellence by Vladimir Putin. It's quite an interesting thing now, Daryl, that we see Zelensky saying, "Okay, put your money where your mouth is. Come to Turkey on Thursday in 4 days' time. I'll be there waiting for you." And it seems very unlikely that Putin actually will be ready to travel to Turkey. But if he doesn't, then that'll be pretty clear that it's not the fault of Ukraine. And we're always looking out to see which way the US will jump. But it seems to me that the time now is for the US to join in with the Europeans in putting those sanctions on Russia first thing Monday.
Okay. Do you have faith in those sanctions? I mean, the sanctions had been pretty harsh from the outbreak of this war, and it doesn't appear to have squeezed Russia out of the war.
There's two things here, really. The first thing is to put pressure on Russia and make it more difficult for them to wage the war. And there's no doubt that has happened. The Russian economy is in terrible straits. They're running out of all sorts of things, manpower as well. But it's not enough to make them stop the war. There are things that the US in particular could do which would really tighten the noose. And in particular, that's what's called secondary sanctions. So this would mean the US saying to countries which at present are importing Russian oil, if you continue to do that, we're going to put sanctions on you. And that would cut off the money that President Putin needs to run this war, and would make a very big difference. I mean, it would be great if we saw some actual negotiations taking place. It would be great to see some kind of ceasefire. But at the moment, all we see is Moscow making more and more demands, including, it seems, to rebuild the entire security of architecture of Europe before they'll even agree to have any talks or even have a 30-day ceasefire. It's extraordinary, these demands. And it's about time the US did something about it.
Okay, on the issues of secondary sanctions then, and other countries, sort of third-party countries and their relationship with Russia, something I found very interesting this week was at Vladimir Putin's Victory Day parade, there were 20 world leaders in attendance. Slovakia's leader was there, Brazil's leader, the usual suspects as well. Of course, China's Xi Jinping was there. There were 9, I think, a year ago. A year before that, there were none. Is that progression, that increase in the number of world leaders willing to travel to Moscow to stand and sit side by side with Vladimir Putin, is that a sign that hostility towards him from the global community is starting to thaw?
I don't think that we're seeing that quite yet. It was true that, in particular, President Xi was there. That's a very significant move. You must remember that this year was the 80th anniversary, so it was a bit more of a bigger event than it has been in previous years. But most countries, with the exception of North Korea and Iran, are really making life quite difficult for Russia. Even the Chinese, with whom Russia in theory has a no-limits partnership, don't like this war. They would far rather that Russia would stop the fighting, and they have not been providing Russia with any weapons throughout this war, quite interestingly, which they could easily have done. If China were to actually start arming Russia, we'd be in a completely different war.
Yeah.
But they haven't done that. So I wouldn't
But China, Leigh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but China obviously makes sense. Look, they have retained a relationship with Russia, as have North Korea. But we're talking here about Slovakia's prime minister. They are a European Union member, Slovakia. Serbia are on the path to becoming a European Union member. Their leader was in Moscow. These people feel emboldened to go to Moscow in a way that they didn't 12 months ago.
Well, I wouldn't read too much significance into it myself. The Serbians are very close to Moscow. President Fico of Slovakia is also somebody who's trying to be different, trying to show that he is sympathetic towards Moscow. So these are, as you said earlier, very much the usual suspects.
But you don't think then, though, that something has changed in the last 12 months? Because they made a decision not to go 12 months ago. Many more a decision not to go 12 months before that. So you don't feel like it's a sign that something has changed, that they do feel emboldened to go, even though, of course, they've shown some support, they've been kind and warm towards Russia, but sort of being there, their presence at this parade in Moscow surely must speak to something.
Sure, Daryl. I mean, I think, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, this is the 80th anniversary, so it's a bigger event, so there's more pull, if you like.
Right.
If we look back to February 2022, when Russia first invaded, countries such as the UK and the US, then under President Biden, most of the European Union were absolutely outraged and they wanted to put maximum pressure on Russia. But at that time, actually, many countries across the so-called global south were very reluctant to get involved in putting pressure on Russia right back then, 3 years ago. So I don't see a massive change of mood here. The only thing I think that is going to bring Russia to the table in any serious way will be either secondary sanctions or the US getting ready to provide bigger military support to Ukraine. Either of those things would really put pressure on Moscow. Until that happens, I'll be very surprised if we start moving towards any serious peace negotiations at this stage.
Okay, what conversation do you think I'll be having on my radio show about this next weekend, Leigh?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball. Things are moving very quickly at the moment. It's remarkable, really. One of the interesting factors here is that it's the 11th of May today, I think, and we have this UK-EU summit coming up on the 19th of May, when there's been all sorts of wrangling going on about everything from youth mobility to fish quotas. But the big one is actually the UK and the EU working more closely on political and military affairs. So I think probably in a week we'll be discussing whether or not these peace talks have happened between Moscow and Kiev. I'd be delighted if they have. I won't be surprised if they haven't. You'll be talking about whether President Trump has come down more clearly on one side or the other. Up to now, he's been pretty clearly on Moscow's side. He seems to respect Putin as a fellow strongman, and he seems to find it easier to put pressure on Zelensky. And I think you'll be talking about why there isn't a ceasefire yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm sure. Leigh, thank you for your time tonight. I appreciate it. Really good to have your company. Leigh Turner, who is a former British ambassador to Ukraine, also the author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties.